Yeah, we called our documentary A New Peace of Münster, and the workshops that we organized in the paired or partnered Dutch and German towns and cities, we called those A New Peace of Münster as well. The original Peace of Münster was in 1648. It was a gathering of actually nations who had been involved in the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War, which is the war between the Netherlands, which wanted independence from Spain, and Spain. That ended at the same time. So you have the 80 Years' War and then the 30 Years' War, and they overlapped, and they conclude in 1648. And all of the peace negotiations take place in the city of Münster, which is very close to the German border. So for the Peace of Münster, which is different from the Westphalian freedom, the parties involved were the Dutch and the Spanish. So the Dutch provinces, 7 provinces, and the Spanish, and they worked out an end to that war. That was important. Interestingly, the Dutch actually weren't entirely on board with ending it, because things were going kind of well towards the end for them, and they thought they might be able to get some more out of it. But at any rate, I wouldn't want to idealize it too much. The Westphalian freedom has some really interesting aspects to it that continue to be of sort of political theoretical significance. Peace of Münster, not so much. The significant thing is that peace was achieved between, the Dutch and the Spanish, and we called this A New Peace of Münster because we wanted to think about a prospective peace, and it wasn't just a peace between Dutch and Germans with a loaded history, not just the Second World War, other things as well, because they're bordering nations. But so not just a prospective peace between Germans and Dutch, but also a peace with others, with strangers, meaning also refugees, for instance, and migrants and immigrants and so on, who, because of climate change, they're already moving, right? Will move more, and right-wing governments and people in general seem very interested in limiting migration and immigration at a time when we should and will expect to see much more of that. So we wanted to focus on a peace with each other, a peace with the stranger or with strangers, and peace with nature, because it seems now really, really crucial that instead of regarding water and nature, as an enemy or simply as a resource that we can abuse and exploit in any way that we want, we need to make peace with nature. So that was the whole idea, to bring it together around this. And it coincided happily with the 375th anniversary, I think, of the Peace of Münster. So in Münster, in the city itself, they were already celebrating with various events, and for that reason, the city was happy to support us too. Comedy and the arts in connection with climate change. That doesn't seem obvious, but it's really, really important. Lots of people don't want to talk about climate change, and probably for good reasons. It's scary, they're afraid of change, they think maybe I'm going to have to change, and so on. And the people who do like to talk about climate change, they talk to each other, and so they don't reach these other people. I have a feeling that lots of people have a sort of vague sense of what climate change is, but not a very distinct and accurate sense of climate change. So this is where comedy comes into the picture. Comedians have license to talk about taboo subjects or controversial subjects because laughter, relaxes people. It gives them a little more license to go a little bit further. You can take an audience along. And what Patrick Nederkoorn does, the person that I collaborated with, is that he makes himself the butt of his own jokes, right? So it isn't on the audience. In other words, instead the audience watches Patrick make himself the object of a critique that says it's time to take climate change really seriously. So he's been immensely effective in doing that in the Netherlands, in broaching subjects that most Dutch people don't really want to talk about. All right, so I'm going to talk about what I've called Plan D. Everybody knows that what Plan B is, right? That's the fallback option if your first and preferred plan doesn't work. So Plan A for the Netherlands is defend the coast and survive, even if sea level rise is extreme. Is there a Plan B? There are a variety of Plan Bs, and some of them involve retreat. And that's a subject that Dutch people do not want to talk about. Not just the public, but people in government, people who are involved in water management, etc. Folks really, really don't want to talk about retreat, and for understandable reasons. So I came up with Plan D because when I was looking at designs of what the Netherlands could look like in 2200 and 2300, these were visions of the Netherlands that were developed by landscape architects and other designers. What I noticed was that necessarily when you imagine people leaving the lower lying regions of the Netherlands, and that's about 26% of the Netherlands that is below sea level, when you imagine them leaving that terrain, they necessarily go to the east, and very soon, because the Netherlands is a small country, very soon they're pushing up against the German border. And it's with Schengen, meaning people can freely cross the border. They can also decide to live there without having to apply for a visa, etc. With Schengen in place, people will, if that happens, people will, of course, spill over the border. And so Plan D for me means Plan Deutschland, or Plan Duitsland, to say it in Dutch, meaning Plan Germany. Germany as an adaptation strategy for the Dutch. Sea level rise, of course, has been, in the last century or two, a very, very slow process, something like 20 centimeters a century. And before that, even less, right? So that sea level rise is accelerating and therefore becoming a threat, posing a threat to the Netherlands, not immediately, but in the long term, and to many places around the world, including coastal areas in the United States, much more immediately. That's a new phenomenon, right? So when we talk about the history of the Netherlands and water, we talk about a history of water management or a way of living with water. The Dutch, and I'm talking about in the first millennium of the Common Era, the Dutch then lived with water. That is to say, water surrounded them, it was intertidal, there were lots of wetlands. They actually knew how to do this. At some point, around maybe 1,000, we're going to just use a really big ballpark figure there, but at some point, folks, and it's actually a little bit earlier, the Romans were doing this too. They would build, because the Romans were in the southern part of the Netherlands, they would build little dikes, little ditches, just to drain some water off, to make land a little more arable, let's say, or to be able to build there, or to have animals there, etc. But in general, they lived with the water. There's a transition. I don't know how gradual it is exactly, but there's a transition that comes from living with water to trying to expel water and to keep it out. That involves dikes and eventually, and gravity, to get water out. But when you're lower than where you want the water to go, you start putting in windmills to power pumps. And when you do that, you'll lift the water up and it goes out. And that's more or less the model that the Dutch are still living with. And it's created lots of problems. I mean, it has allowed prosperity for sure, but it's also created lots of problems. One of them is subsidence. If you pump water up and out, you expose peat. Peat oxidizes and then condenses and sinks. So parts of the Netherlands that are now almost 7 meters below sea level used to be above sea level or at sea level, right? So they've been sinking over the centuries. So that's a problem. So that's where the Dutch are now. And the question, and it's a $1 trillion question, is can the Dutch continue with a protection strategy, keeping water out and continuing to pump it out? Because that gets crazy, because the Rhine River flows into the Netherlands. And if they have to close off the mouth of the Rhine, they will have to pump all of that water up and over. They have calculated that they would need an array of industrial pumps that runs 6 to 10 kilometers. So imagine all of those pumps in order to lift all of the Rhine at peak discharge up and into the North Sea. So it's either that, can they continue to protect, or can they anticipate that maybe in the long term they won't be able to keep up with accelerated sea level rise? There's a chance that that might be true. Or that sea level rise just isn't going to be polite enough to stop at 2 meters or at 5 meters, but is going to continue. And at a certain point, it just gets too crazy. I mean, do you want to live in the shadow of a dike that is 20, 25 meters high? So you'd be down here and you'd be looking up there, and the ocean or the sea is on the other side. So that's sort of the situation that they're in. And at this point, I would say they're trying to figure it out, but it's very, very difficult, because the gut tendency, for reasons that are totally comprehensible, is stay at all costs. Figure out how to do it. And it does seem like the Dutch and folks in government, folks who are involved in water management, have sort of made an inner decision that they're going to protect the Netherlands, such as it is, at all costs. They're just trying to figure out, how can we do this? And it isn't just a matter of protection, it's also all of the environmental or ecological devastation. I'm going to say seriously, it's devastation that occurs if you choose that route, because so much land will be penetrated by salt, for instance, will become non-arable or only arable in a different way. So the Netherlands is good, and these dikes, for every meter you go up, you need to go wide 9 or 10 meters. So you're going to have really huge kind of incursions on existing built environment and so on. There's so many things, so many things that are going to be different, and so it's a dicey situation. Right? We're watching Thwaites Glacier on Antarctica, and the science that we're hearing about indicates that it's going a lot faster than we thought, or our models, or I don't know, maybe our models did include this, but at any rate, it's going faster. It's surprising people what they're finding, right? So there's that. And then if AMOC collapses, then that also will have an impact on sea level rise, and not a good one, and so on. So, chances are this century will still be okay, right? But there are a few really significant X factors out there that we just don't know about. And to talk about RCP 8.5, right, which is the worst case scenario, that's and say, probably because of all the renewable energy that we're bringing into play and all the other things that are going on that are positive, et cetera, we can probably rule out over 3 degrees Celsius warming. Maybe true. Hopefully it's true. But those X factors aren't a part of that scenario, because these things have already been set in motion. Yeah. So the biggest lesson, or maybe lessons, that I want folks to take away from this film, there are a couple or maybe 3. One is that climate change and migration go hand in hand, right? And And migration is a really, really serious subject. We need to think about it, and we need to have a different attitude towards migration. So that's perhaps the second thing. We think that working comedy into the discussion, into the sort of form of the discussion, is a way of lightening things up, shaking things up, seeing things differently. When strangers meet, they often resort to humor if it's not too pressured a situation, right? They find their cultural differences amusing. Perhaps there are jokes, or there are other ways. But humor is a way in which you can diffuse a situation, see it differently, and move forward. So this isn't exactly a plea for injecting lots of humor into very serious discussions, but it is an argument for seeing things in a much larger framework. Getting more people involved than just the usual suspects. Anticipating sort of realistically, but also positively, thinking about all the wonderful things that come with migration and immigration. So I guess we're hoping that with this movie, we give an example of setting a different tone for the kinds of difficult conversations that not just the Dutch and Germans, but basically everybody who's affected by climate change, especially in situations where there will be movements of population, so that they also can approach this in a different, much less defensive way than we're seeing right now. Right. So there is reason to be concerned about the new extreme right-wing coalition that was introduced a few weeks ago. We're talking, what is it now? Beginning of July or thereabouts, because members of that coalition, especially from the extreme right, tend to be climate deniers, tend to be protectionist, and I see that protectionism at work, both with regard to water and climate, like shut it out, keep it out, right? Shut out the water, build higher dikes, etc. And so it's likely that they will settle on that policy at a point where it isn't clear that that's the best policy. And it may also be the case that they'll cut off or reduce the kind of research funding that is necessary, to continue to develop alternatives to this. And that protectionism then also goes to, keeping migrants out. This Dutch government, this new government, has almost like a zero admission rate for refugees. They just don't want any refugees to enter. They want to put it on pause. Don't allow any more in. But the Dutch have not done well in accepting refugees so far relative, to other European countries, and there really is no good reason for that. So there's reason to be concerned that this government is going to get in the way of the Dutch moving forward prudently with a long-term vision on adapting to climate change.